When we think of a revolution, we usually picture something big and loud, right? Like flags, protests, major historical moments. But what if I told you that some of the biggest revolutions in history were completely silent? That they happened with objects we don't even think twice about today?
Okay, take a look at these three things: a fork, a zipper, and a standard shipping container. I mean, they couldn't seem more different, could they? But believe it or not, they all share a wild, secret history.
And here it is. This is the big connection. Every single one of them was a brilliant, world-changing idea that you'd think would be an instant hit. But instead, they were met with total ridicule, they were condemned as sinful, or they just completely failed in the marketplace. Their stories tell us something really surprising about how change actually happens.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to dive into the fork's totally scandalous past. Then, we'll look at the zipper and why nobody wanted it for 20 years. After that, we'll unpack the story of the simple metal box that basically created the modern global economy. And at the end, we'll pull it all together and see what these hidden revolutions can teach us today.
So, let's start with the fork. Its biggest battle wasn't a flaw in its design or a bad business plan. No, its battle was against culture, tradition, and even God himself.
So, picture this. It's the 11th century. We're in Venice at this massive royal wedding feast. A princess from Byzantium, Theodora, does something that just makes the entire room gasp. Instead of eating with her hands, like every single other person there, she takes out this small, golden, two-pronged fork. And the court was absolutely horrified.
And the reaction wasn't just, raised eyebrows. It was vicious. The church leaders immediately went on the attack. A very influential figure, St. Peter Damian, actually preached that God gave us natural forks, our fingers. To use an artificial one is a direct insult to him. So to them, this wasn't just a new utensil. It was literally blasphemy.
And it gets even more intense. A little while later, Theodora tragically died from the plague. But the church officials? They didn't see it as a disease. They went out and publicly announced that her death was divine punishment from God himself, all because she dared to use a fork. That's how deep the resistance was.
So yeah, this cultural fight took centuries. The fork was anything but an overnight success. For 500 years, it was pretty much just stuck in Italy, and even there, people were suspicious of it. In other places, like France or England, any man who used a fork was openly made fun of for being effeminate, like he wasn't manly enough to touch his own food. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution, hundreds of years later, that the fork finally became a normal thing on our tables.
Okay, let's switch gears for our second story. This time, the resistance wasn't cultural. It was all about business. This is the story of the zipper, an invention that was a complete and total failure for 2 decades. Our story kicks off at the giant Chicago World's Fair back in 1893. An inventor named Whitcomb Judson reveals his brand new creation, the clasp locker. It was supposed to be a high-tech replacement for the hassle of buttoning up your boots. But there was just one tiny problem. It didn't work. It was clumsy, it was sharp, and it would just pop right open all the time. As you can imagine, nobody bought it. It was a flop.
So, what changed? Well, it all came down to the engineering. That first version, the clasp locker, was this really clunky system of hooks and eyes. It took another 20 years and a totally different engineer named Gideon Sunback to really nail the design. He's the one who came up with the interlocking teeth and the slider that we all know today. He made it flexible, smooth, and most importantly, he made it reliable.
But even a version that worked wasn't enough to make it a success. It needed 3 more things to happen. First, it needed a better name. In 1923, the B.F. Goodrich Company put it on some rubber boots, and the marketing guy loved the zzz sound it made. He called it the zipper, and the name was perfect. Then it needed its big break. It finally found its perfect use in the 1930s, when it was sold to parents as an easy way for their kids to dress themselves. It won what they called the Battle of the Fly against buttons, and the rest is history.
And that brings us to our last story, and honestly, this one might be the most impactful of them all. The problem here wasn't culture, and it wasn't a bad product. The challenge was fighting against the inertia of an entire global system. This is the story of the shipping container.
The hero of this story isn't some famous genius inventor. He was a truck driver from North Carolina named Malcolm McLean. Back in 1937, he was sitting in his truck at a port, just waiting for hours and hours, watching dock workers slowly load his cargo onto a ship, one piece at a time. And as he sat there, getting more and more frustrated with how inefficient it all was, he had a thought that was so simple, yet so revolutionary.
Now, to really get his idea, you have to understand the old way of doing things, which was called break bulk shipping. I mean, every single item was loaded by hand. Every single barrel, every sack, every crate. It was painfully slow, which made it insanely expensive. A ship would often spend more time just sitting in port being loaded than it actually spent at sea. McLean's idea? Why not just load the entire truck trailer right onto the ship?
And really, it all came down to the numbers. Before Malcolm McLean, using that old break bulk system, the average cost just to load cargo onto a ship was $5.86 a ton.
After McLean introduced his system of standardized containers, that cost absolutely plummeted, all the way down to just 16 cents a ton.
Let that sink in for a second. That simple metal box led to a 97% reduction in loading costs. It is not an exaggeration to say this one invention is what made our modern global economy possible. That phone in your pocket, that cheap t-shirt you bought, you can thank the shipping container. It basically made distance irrelevant when it comes to the cost of making things.
Okay, so we've got a blasphemous utensil, a gadget nobody wanted, and a boring metal box. What happens when we put these three stories together? What can they teach us about innovation?
Let's just lay it all out. Each of these innovations had to fight a totally different kind of battle. The fork was a social innovation, and it had to fight against centuries of religious and cultural norms. The zipper was a mechanical innovation, and it had to fight its own technical flaws. And the container was an economic one, fighting against entire systems. Powerful labor unions were terrified of losing jobs, and ports didn't want to pay for all the new standardized equipment. Different resistance, but in the end, the same world-changing result.
So what are the big takeaways here? First, and this is the most important one, a great idea is almost never enough by itself. You're always going to face resistance, and it can come from culture, from the market, or from the system itself. The zipper story shows us that things like timing, good engineering, and brilliant marketing can be just as important as the idea. And maybe the biggest lesson of all is that the revolutions that really change our world are often the ones hiding in plain sight.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Just look around you right now. What common things, or even ideas that we use today, might be fighting their own invisible war against cultural norms, or commercial disinterest, or a system that just doesn't want to change? What's the next great revolution that's hiding right in front of our eyes?